Good morning, friends. It's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I'm here with the first video of the 2022 Every Bit Counts Challenge. So welcome to my homestead. I'm going to show you all of the food preservation projects that I've been up to this week. So let's go ahead and get started. This week I started one day early. On the last day of July, I went out and harvested all of our carrots from one of our beds because, as you can see, the bunnies were starting to chew on them, and some of them were decent sized, but a lot of them were tiny. We were just going to put these in the fridge and eat raw, but today I wanted to focus on preserving these carrot tops. So a lot of people don't know that carrot tops are edible. They taste a lot like parsley, so that's how I preserve them. I'm going to freeze dry them just like parsley and use them like the herb to season different things. They also make a great pesto, and all the extras that we had left over, we fed to the cows, so there was no waste. They love them and will eat them up. So make sure if you're harvesting your carrots, especially if you didn't plant any parsley this year, that you go ahead and preserve those and don't let them go to waste. Now we're going to move on to the beginning of the official challenge. August 1st, I needed to do something with eggs. We have a buildup of eggs, so I'm pulling out any of them that are clean and don't need washed. They have no mud or filth on them at all. They're being water glassed. I've done many videos on water glassing eggs, and I'll link one in the description so you can learn all about that. But you can only water glass clean, unwashed eggs. So the rest of the eggs that are a little bit dirty need to be washed, and that's what I'm doing here. Now, I've preserved eggs lots of ways this year, and so I'm looking for some new creative ways to preserve, and today I have decided that I'm going to salt cure some egg yolks. I've got my salt there. I've got a little lidded container that I can use to do this in. I've got a measuring cup here so that I can measure out my egg whites that I'm going to accumulate to freeze for later. And I have some jars to freeze the egg whites in, and then I'm all ready to go. So to salt cure your egg yolks, you're just going to need a high quality salt here. You want one without the anti-caking agents. I'm using a pink Himalayan salt. You could use a sea salt, anything like that. You just want it to not have the caking agents and the other additives. Because this is salt that doesn't have the caking agents, I'm having to break apart the stuff that has kind of caked together in storage. But I'm putting like a nice thick layer here on the bottom of my container. And then once I get that all filled up, I'm going to take a spoon and I'm going to make little indents in the salt, and that's where we're going to put our yolks. So a lot of people might be wondering, why would I salt cure egg yolks? What is the purpose of that? And that's a good question. And you may not know that we are a family, we cannot have dairy, and that's because my son has an anaphylactic dairy allergy. And so salt cured egg yolks actually taste like Parmesan cheese. The salt curing process pulls all of the water out of them, and then they become hard to the point that you can actually grate them like a little piece of cheese and put that grated yolk on top of your spaghetti, on top of your lasagna, anywhere that you would normally put a Parmesan cheese. The egg yolks with the salt curing have kind of that umami flavor. It's just really good. And so that is why I'm doing this, because I think this will be a great way for us to get that Parmesan flavor that we miss so much. Basically, what's going to happen here is these yolks are going to sit in this salt for about 7 to 10 days. The salt is going to draw out all of the moisture from the eggs. And then after the 7 to 10 days, we'll pull the yolks out. They're going to dry for another week in the fridge, and then they'll be ready to go to be used right away, or we can put them in the freezer for storage. 1 dozen eggs leaves me with 2 cups of egg yolks, and that is perfect. My angel food cake recipe that I use calls for 2 cups of egg yolks. And so I'm just going to put those yolks in the freezer, and then this winter when I want to make an angel food cake, I can thaw those and be ready to go. So that works out perfectly. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking this is a whole lot of salt, and we are going to add more because I'm going to pull out more salt and cover now the top of these yolks with a nice thick layer of salt. And you may be thinking, well, that's a huge waste of salt, and this is an expensive project for something such a small amount of yolks. But this salt can be reused over and over again for this purpose, and that's what I will do with this salt. I'm going to show you this after the week that it sits in the fridge. I'll show you how you can take this salt, dry it out in the oven, and reuse it to do another batch of yolks. So this salt will not be wasted. It will be used over and over again, and that's what makes this a little more cost effective than if you were just using all this salt and had to get rid of it after the first use. So once again, just covering all of these yolks with a thick layer of salt. And this is perfectly safe. This is a safe way of preserving all of that salt cured meat that you eat, bacon that is cured, things like that. This is the same process that it goes through. So we don't have to worry about foodborne illness as long as we're thoroughly covering those yolks with a nice thick layer of salt. They're going to pull all the moisture out and preserve these perfectly. We're just going to cover up this container, stick it in our fridge, and then it's going to be ready to go in about 7 to 10 days. And I will show you what that looks like in next week's video. So the next project I wanted to do on this day was just use up some of the odds and ends vegetables that I have in the fridge that I needed to do something with before they were going to go bad. We have produce coming in every day from the garden, so if I don't use up what's already there in some way, then it will be wasted. So I had some celery tops here that I'm throwing into the freeze dryer. I also have some green peppers here that I'm just kind of chopping up. Those celery tops will be great added to broth or soup that I want to make this winter. And then these green peppers can be rehydrated, added to casseroles, scrambled eggs, you name it, anywhere you would use a raw green pepper. These will be great. Freeze drying really leaves a nice texture after it is rehydrated. If you're not familiar with freeze drying, it's a process that is kind of similar to dehydrating food, except with a dehydrator, you heat the food a little bit in order to remove all the moisture from it. With a freeze dryer, the food is frozen, and then there's a vacuum pump that is attached to the machine that sucks out all of the moisture and leaves it dried for you to put into storage. So very similar processes. I just find that the texture is slightly different in my freeze-dried food. It's a little fluffier, less cooked feeling when it's rehydrated. So I'm preferring to preserve a lot of my random veggies in this way this year since I have the freeze dryer. If you're interested in learning about freeze drying, check out the link in the description. That will show you what we have. So I'm also slicing up some zucchini and some tomatoes here. Both of those can be freeze dried and powdered after they're dry. The tomato powder can be used to make tomato paste. Zucchini powder is great as a flour replacer. And we're just going to load these now into the freeze dryer. You can also just rehydrate those sliced tomatoes or zucchini and add them to casseroles or whatever you want later on in the winter. So this is a great way to preserve food. I feel like the texture is superior. I really like the quality of what I get. It's a great way to use up those odds and ends. So I've been running this pretty much 24/7 in the last month. All right, now it's Tuesday. Time to figure out another project. So I'm in the garden looking at what needs to be preserved, and I kind of knew that we had a lot of kale and a lot of basil. So I figured this would be a great day to pick all of the extras, and we are going to make some pesto. Pesto is so delicious, and let me show you how I make mine. Here are all of my ingredients. I have my kale, I have my basil, I have garlic, some of our homegrown garlic. I'm thawing a little bit of squeezed lemon juice here. I last night knew I was going to make pesto, so I have cashews soaking. We have some olive oil back there, and then we'll use salt, and that is all I put in my pesto. We just throw all of that into the food processor here. And I'm not someone who measures and uses a specific recipe when it comes to making my pesto. I just kind of wing it and do what feels right and what tastes right to me. So you can make pesto with just about anything, any kind of green. You can use all different kinds of nuts. Some people prefer walnuts or pine nuts. I like cashews because that's what we keep in bulk here in our house to make a lot of our dairy-free dishes. This pesto will be used as a pasta sauce. It'll be used as a pizza sauce. Sometimes I make stuffed pasta shells and add meat to it. It can be a layer in my lasagna. So many different uses. We really love pesto. So the first batch that I did on this day was just with the basil, and I froze a batch of that. And then in the subsequent batches, I mixed it with the kale. The kale has more of a bitter taste, and so sometimes in some dishes I prefer just to use the basil alone. In other dishes, I don't mind having that kale flavor in with it. So it's just whatever you prefer. I mentioned earlier in this video, you can make a great pesto out of carrot tops. I've foraged before and made videos about how I've made pesto from wild purple nettle that I've gotten in my own yard. So just so many ways you can make pesto. Last time I showed this tool that takes the stems off of the kale, I had lots of questions about it, so I'm going to leave a link in the description about showing where you can get one of these. But this is a really handy tool, and we definitely do not waste our kale stems. They are edible, and as I've said many times, every little bit counts, and those kale stems count towards our nutrition and our food storage. So I'm going to show you in a minute how we're going to preserve that. But first, just getting all of this kale destemmed so that I can add it to my pesto here. And I'm just freezing my pesto in little half-pint containers. That's what works perfectly for me. The day before I'm going to use it, I just pull it out and put it in the fridge, and it will thaw and be ready the next day for whatever meal I want to use it in. Now, there's all my pesto, and once again, I wanted to show you what I do with my kale stems. I keep a little container in my freezer, and every time I have kale stems, I just kind of snap them off into little pieces, and these are delicious in stir fry. So that adds some green to our stir fries in the winter. They seem to, when they thaw and get cooked, they're the perfect texture, kind of like a green bean texture. So those will not be wasted. We're going to tuck those away in the freezer as well today. And here we go. These are the trays that I loaded the day before. They are all done. So I'm going to get that freeze dryer defrosting so I can get it loaded up again, because as I mentioned, I like that thing running 24/7 to use up food that I'm pulling in from the garden. So if I'm going to use the freeze-dried food within the next 9 months, I'm going to use that sometime this year. It is safe to put in glass jars with a nice tight lid and just set it up on my pantry shelves. No oxygen absorber needed. If I'm not going to use the food within the next year, I will put it in Mylar bags with an oxygen absorber to go in my long-term food storage. But you do not need the oxygen absorber as long as it's going to be in glass with a nice tight lid. Now, you do not want to use plastic to store your freeze-dried food because plastic can over time allow oxygen in and just isn't the best for storing these types of things. So even if you don't want to use your canning jars for this purpose, because maybe you're limited in the number of canning jars that you have, this is a great way to repurpose old salsa jars or pickle jars or any kind of glass jar you get from store-bought food. Save those, wash them out. You can use those to store your dehydrated and freeze-dried stuff on your pantry shelves. Just comforting a little guy who needed my help, always as the busy mom in the kitchen working, have to help with the kids as needed. So that's what I got done on this day. Lots of yummy stuff we're going to add to the larder. I wanted to show you this little freezer that we have, our little stand-up freezer. It has the blueberries in it that we preserved last month. Some more blueberries up here on this shelf. I put the egg whites from yesterday up there, and there's my pesto. And the rest of this is empty. We're going to see how full we can get this freezer by the end of the month. I am excited to see what we can accomplish with this challenge. And my final job for today is doing some prep work for tomorrow's project. I'm getting some beef bones in the oven roasting so that I can can some broth. Now, you do not have to roast your bones to make broth. It just adds a lot of extra flavor, so that's why I am doing it. Now, once those bones were done roasting for about 45 minutes or so, I put them in a big pot with some water, and I've got that simmering outside on the propane stove. Of course, putting a lid on top of it to keep any bugs and critters out of it. And after about 2 hours, I took that inside and let it cool off and then put it in the fridge overnight. The next morning, I filled 7 quart jars here with onions. They have about 1 large onion each. I pulled my broth out of the fridge here, and I'm going to can onion broth today. This is a great base for soups, French onion soup, any kind of soup you want to make. This onion broth is just amazing. Now, one of the benefits to putting your broth in the fridge is that all of the fat in it rises to the top and solidifies, so you can scoop all that out and get it out. Now, normally I would keep that fat in my broth, but when I'm canning broth, I want to get as much fat out of there as possible. And that's because if for some reason that broth siphons out of your jars and there's fat in there, that can compromise your seal. That'll leave grease on the rim of your jar and could compromise your seal. So I try to get as much of that fat out as possible. You can see I'm even straining it as I'm putting it in the jar. And then that fat can be saved. You can cook with it later, or we fed it to our chickens and they just love it. You'll notice that my broth here is kind of cloudy, and that's because I used 8 large beef bones to make this small amount of broth. And all of the marrow in the bones kind of emulsified and made the broth cloudy, and that's fine. It's nutritious, it's healthy. You will notice through the canning process, the heat and cooking the onions, this will turn more to like a regular beef broth color. Now I overfilled some of my jars here. You only want, or you want to have about 1-inch headspace when you're canning broth, and I'm getting some of that extra broth out of some of these jars that I overfilled to kind of even it out, and then I'll just top off that last jar with a little bit of water if it's not full enough. As I mentioned, making sure that the tops, the rims of your jars are not greasy is extremely important. So always get a clean rag and really wipe those rims well to make sure that you get a good seal. You don't want to go to all of this work and then have seal failures because you skipped this important step. Now we're putting our lids on. Remember, you can get 10% off of your 4 jars canning lids if you use my code 3rivers10. You can see the link in the description, but I've been using these lids since the beginning of the year and have yet to have a lid failure, which is pretty amazing for canning lids. So I can't recommend them enough. Now this broth is going to process in the pressure canner for 85 minutes. We are treating it like a vegetable soup since it has the solid onions in it, and so we need to process it longer than regular broth. 85 minutes will do the trick, and then we'll have some shelf-stable, wonderful onion broth to use as a base for our French onion soup. One other tiny project on this day, I harvested some blackberries from the garden and just got a little 1.5 pints in the freezer, and that'll make a nice blackberry cobbler this winter. Every bit counts, adding that to the freezer stash. Okay, and it's the next morning. Our onion broth sat out overnight and all of our seals are good. Praise the Lord. But we did have a little bit of siphoning, so I'm having to do a little bit of work on just cleaning the grease off of those lids and off of the outside of my jars. You always want to make sure you get your jars as clean as possible before you put them in the pantry. You don't want to attract any pests if you have any kind of food residue on the outside of your jars, and you just don't want to have bacteria and other things growing on that. So the key to food preservation is just to keep things as clean as possible. So doing a thorough job here of just making sure everything is clean before I label and store these away. When I can tell pretty easily what is in the jar, I just write the date on top. If it's something that I would have to guess at by looking at it, I will be a little more specific on my labeling. But the date worked on this. And then, as always, pick your jars up by the lid to test your seals. And if they're good, those can be tucked away and added to your pantry shelves. Always a good feeling. 7 more quarts added to the pantry. Now for today's project. Remember those carrots that we harvested on Sunday? I picked out most of the large ones and we were saving those for raw, fresh eating. But a lot of these little ones, they'll go soft in the fridge over time. So I'm just giving them a really good scrub. Remember, you want things as clean as possible for food preservation, and these carrots were dirty from being harvested from the garden. So giving them a nice thorough scrub. And we are going to be shredding these today to store. Shredded carrots are great to have on hand for things like carrot muffins or carrot cake, even just to throw a few handfuls into soup and things like that. So I'm just chopping up these little carrots and tossing them into my food processor here. We're going to shred them up and then we are going to freeze dry them today. If you don't have a freeze dryer, what I've done in the past is just frozen them. I would portion them out into a 1/2 cup portions and put each 1/2 cup into a muffin tin cup. Flash freeze the muffin pan in the freezer, and then you can pop out those little carrot pucks and then add them to a gallon bag to store for later. And then you already have little 1/2 cup portions measured out for you. It works great with carrots. It also works great with zucchini. So if you don't have a freeze dryer, that's how I would do it. You could also throw these in your dehydrator and do it that way. So we filled 3 trays with carrots, and then I had some of the leftover kale from the pesto we made earlier in the week, and I just decided to fill that last tray with that. While we're waiting on the freeze dryer to come to temperature, I ran out to the freezer and noticed that I have 3 bags of peaches left over from 2021, and they're getting kind of nasty and old, and I need to do something with them. So I've decided that today I'm going to make some peach butter, and that's just one less thing I'll have to preserve this year. So we're going to toss all of these into a pot, but first my freeze dryer was finally at temperature, so I could get these trays in there and ready to go. So once again, if you'd like to know more about freeze drying, check the link in my description. But this is what the peaches are looking like. Just literally dumped those bags into the pot and just put a small, maybe about 1 inch of water on the bottom so that as it heats, it didn't stick or burn. And then after a few hours, those peaches have cooked down and are nice and soft so that they can be blended. An immersion blender is a really great tool for food preservation in general, but it's great for making fruit sauces, tomato sauce, things like that. You can just blend this up, peels and all, and get it into a really perfect, smooth texture. The immersion blender saves you the extra step of having to dump this all into a blender or a food processor later on. It's really handy. Now we're going to add our spices for the peach butter. We can add cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, allspice, anything you want. The spices don't affect the safety of the canning process. It's more just for preference, for taste. So we did cinnamon and nutmeg on this day, and we're just getting it mixed together there. And then we are just going to cook this peach sauce down to get it as thick as possible. But first, I was in the process of getting this stirred, and the kids said, "Can we have some of that for dinner?" And I said, "Of course," because at this point, it's kind of like a peach sauce. It's not a peach butter. So I portioned some out for them to have, put the rest in a crock pot, and I am working on dinner here. Those kids, they smelled those peaches as soon as I pulled it off the stove. So not going to last long with these hungry children. All right, the next morning, those carrots are done, and I am just so pleased with the texture of how these freeze-dried shredded carrots turned out. These are going to be so convenient for using this winter. I can just store these in my jar, and then if my recipe calls for 2 cups of shredded carrots, I can just literally, pour out 2 cups and rehydrate and throw it right into my cake batter or whatever I'm making. So very excited, very pleased with how these turned out, and this is likely how I will preserve most of my carrots from now on. Some of you are probably wondering how much it costs to run a freeze dryer and if that's factored into everything. And it's about $2 in energy cost to run the freeze dryer. So if these are veggies that I pulled from my garden, the only cost I really have in these then, since I'm reusing containers, is the $2 energy cost. So that's great for, almost 4 quarts of food I'm getting out of this batch. The kale will also go into a quart jar here, and I'm just packing it down. This dried kale can be added to soup. I can also powder it down and add it to smoothies. It'll basically just become a green powder that I can use in a variety of ways. Add it to my baking, whatever I want to do with this kale come wintertime. So very happy with that. 3.5 quarts of food. Now really quickly, let me show you what I'm doing with just the random tomatoes. I'm not quite harvesting enough tomatoes yet to have full batches for big canning projects. So what you can do if you just have a few ripe tomatoes like this is just put them, well, first you want to wash them really well, and then you're going to pull off the stems, and then you can just put them raw, no blanching necessary or anything, right into your gallon freezer bags. And just start filling bags up until you accumulate enough tomatoes to do a batch of tomato sauce or do a batch of ketchup or whatever you want to can your tomatoes to do. And this is great. It's really convenient because when you pull out and thaw those tomatoes, you can run the frozen tomato under warm water and the skins will just slip right off. It's so convenient. So this little bag of tomatoes is heading to the freezer. And then right here, I wanted to show you the pear butter sat in the crock pot all night and thickened up. I had kind of rigged the crock pot lid so that the steam would escape and that this would continue to thicken with the water evaporation. And we ended up with just 5 little half pints after it all cooked down. But hey, every bit counts, so we're going to be happy with that and add these to the shelves. You may be wondering what we use peach butter or any kind of fruit butter for, and since we can't have dairy, we can't have bread on or butter on our bread, we do a lot of jams and jellies and fruit butters whenever we want to eat homemade bread or biscuits or things like that. So these will definitely be eaten by the children. We can never have enough. So just getting my lids on there. Once again, with sticky stuff like this, really make sure you wiped those rims well. And remember, if you want 10% off of your canning lids, check the info in the description and you can use my code. Remember, if you have hard water, it's helpful to pour a little distilled white vinegar into your canning pot, and that prevents your mineral buildup. Went ahead and did that, and now we're going to process these jars for 10 minutes in the water bath, and that's all it takes. And then after they processed for 10 minutes, they were all done, and I've got my little helper Elizabeth here pulling them out. And we'll let these sit on the counter for 24 hours to make sure the seals are good before we label and store them away. So another 5 little jars to add to the shelves. Something to remember if you do have a freeze dryer is that you really should be cleaning this frequently in between batches if possible. I do it about every 3 batches or so, just because you can get mold, you can get food that's spilled in the back there. It is a wet, dark place. If you're not using it every day, you could definitely get mold. I pour vinegar through the tubing in the back every couple of runs just to make sure the tubing is staying clean. Just really wipe everything down. Remember, the key to safe food preservation is cleanliness. And so you want to make sure your equipment is as clean as possible. And since we got our freeze dryer all cleaned up, why not load it up with another batch? So our final project for this day, I went out to the garden and harvested a bunch of celery. This year, celery is doing great. I've had terrible results with growing celery in the past. You can see these this year are nice and beautiful and big, and that is because I decided to buy plant starts from a local nursery this year instead of growing them from seed. Growing celery from seed is not one of the skills that I possess, so we are happy to rely on local nurseries to meet our celery start needs from now on. So we're just chopping away, and Gracie wanted to show me the project that was working on. She had embroidered a new pillowcase for herself, and it was so adorable. I love it. So anyways, back to the chopping. So we are just chopping this celery, and once again, celery is great for future soups. We can also rehydrate it and add it to things like chicken salad or egg salad or whatever we want to use it for through the winter. So first we're chopping and separating the stalks of the celery from the greens so that we can store them separately because they will be used separately. The greens are primarily just for soups and broths. Notice the little ones are in here. We've got some helpers, and we had an extra tray, so we are going to work on chopping up this parsley. I also had an abundance of parsley in the garden that I don't need right now fresh, so Elizabeth is chopping that up for the final tray. And here we go. These are what our trays look like. This is going to be delicious. And these children are eating just as much celery as I think they've preserved. They really love that celery. So teaching Elizabeth how to load that up. I think she's still eating the celery. Look, as she's loading it up. Too funny. Okay, and on our final day of the first week of the Every Bit Counts challenge, we did a little bit of a less traditional food preservation project. Every year, our good friend who raises our pork for us, he brings the 3 pigs that we ordered from him. They have already been butchered and are packaged and ready for the freezer. He brings them to us along with some firewood and some hay for our animals for the winter. So on this day, we are counting this as our food preservation project because there was quite a bit of work to do in unloading everything, getting the freezers filled and organized, getting all of the hay up into the hay loft so that the animals can eat all winter. So there really wasn't time to do any canning or food preserving on this day. So the children were all very diligently helping us get all of this work done because our reward, what we always do for our friend in thanks for him delivering this to us and helping us get it unloaded, I prepare a huge feast for him. He loves pie, so I make sure to make him plenty of pies, and we all sit down and eat together when all of the work was done. So that is what we did on this day. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this first week of the Every Bit Counts challenge. I'm really enjoying checking out the hashtag Every Bit Counts challenge, both here on YouTube and on Instagram. I'm really inspired by all of the preservation projects everybody else is doing, getting lots of great ideas. So if you haven't yet, make sure that you check out the hashtag and follow along with everybody else who is participating. Next week, I'll bring you another video showing all of the projects that I did. And in the meantime, we're going to get back to work here on the homestead. It's a busy time of year, putting away all of the produce that's coming in from the garden, getting all of the wood stacked for winter, getting everything prepared so the animals can eat all winter. Even though summer's not even over, we have a lot of work to do, and now is the time to prepare. But at the end of the day, when the work's done, we get to enjoy the bounty of all of our hard work. And so that's what we're doing on this day. I hope you and your family are blessed, and we will see you next week.